Must elders have children who believe? This is a very important question for the church, and we're going to talk about this coming up. This is the Bible Sojourner, where we discuss issues related to the Bible, theology, and culture. I'm your host, Peter Gaiman, professor of Old Testament and Biblical Languages at Shepherd's Theological Seminary. Shalom and welcome. Thanks for joining. Well, I'm excited to welcome you to today's episode. I'm here with Dr. Timothy Miller, and I'm just super pumped to have him on the episode today. We're going to be talking about believing children or faithful children and whether or not the translations have that correct. And so I'm excited to have him on the podcast talking about that issue. But I want to introduce Tim Miller as one of the newest faculty and staff members at Shepherd's Theological Seminary. Really excited for him to join the crew here. And so really blessed already by his ministry. And so I wanted to actually ask him to introduce himself a little bit and just talk about kind of his upbringing, from whence you come, as it were, and where you're going, like why you wound up here. So, Tim, you want to just introduce yourself a little bit?
Yeah. So I'm grateful to the Lord that I was born in a family that went to church, and so young age came to faith, and was able then to follow what the Lord was desiring for me. Went to a school called Maranatha in Watertown, Wisconsin, in the Midwest. Actually,
we have some listeners from Maranatha.
Yeah, that's right. Well, I was from Michigan and then went to Wisconsin, met my wife there. Then the Lord led us out to Calvary in Lansdale, Pennsylvania, where I did my Master of Divinity work. And then because Calvary was right next to Westminster Theological Seminary, I did my PhD work there right away. Maranatha then called me back to teach in the undergraduate department there at the university, and did that for 4 years. Then through God's providence was led to Detroit Baptist Theological Seminary and was there for the last 8 years. While there, I had a few opportunities to come out to Shepherd's to teach a few courses. And so as I did that, got to know some of the faculty here, the administration here, that led to a fruitful relationship. And this last year, they asked whether I might be interested in coming on to become the dean of the seminary and also to teach in the New Testament and theology program. Because while I was at Midwestern, I suppose I should add this, while I was at Detroit, they asked me whether I would do a second PhD in New Testament. And the point of that was they wanted me to take over the New Testament division eventually. And so I did a PhD at Midwestern in New Testament. And now the Lord's led me here, and I'm excited about that because I didn't get a lot of opportunity to teach on the systematic theology side at Detroit because we were pretty heavy in that, and we had some great faculty in that. So I was teaching more on the New Testament side. Coming here, there are lots of classes to be taught and lots of opportunity, and so I'm just thrilled with the opportunities that sit before me. I'm excited for Shepherds. We're in just a wonderful spot. The Lord has brought together an incredible faculty. The facilities that are here, our location, everything goes together in such a way that I'm just excited about the future of this institution, and I'm just humbled by God's kindness in leading my family here. I should mention them, the important part of my ministry. I have a wife, Hannah, and then 3 daughters, 11, 10, and 8 right now. And so I'm just thrilled about them being here at the Shepherd's Church and growing in faith. And so I'm thrilled to be here.
Oh, that's great. Thank you for introducing yourself. And I know a lot of people are going to be just really thrilled to be able to take classes from you. Speaking of which, I know this is kind of off topic for just a moment, but because you've done those 2 PhDs, any specific research interests on the New Testament side or systematic theology that just really interest you?
Yeah. So on the theological side, my degree was in apologetics, which you go to Westminster in Philadelphia. That's their specialty.
Oh yeah.
But what I focused on there, because the apologetics is really a philosophy degree, it's Christian philosophy. And I focused on Trinitarian theology, particularly John Frame's perspectivalism. If anybody's ever read even a paragraph of John Frame, they've heard about a triad. And so I was looking into the Trinitarian roots of that. So I have some interest there. On the New Testament side, my focus was on the use of the New Testament in the New Testament. And by that, I mean the use of Jesus's words in the epistolary literature. And in particular, my focus was on 1 Peter. So how did the words of Jesus influence 1 Peter, which is a difficult thing to adjudicate, primarily because Peter never quotes Jesus, but he alludes to him all over the place. So that's been a research interest as well.
Oh, that's super great. And I think perhaps future podcast episodes.
Yeah,
we'll
I love that.
Well, today we're going to be talking about Titus 1 and the qualifications for elders. And so I just wanted to read the NASB version here of this, the New American Standard. And so in Paul writing to Titus, he says, "For this reason I left you in Crete, that you would set in order what remains and appoint elders in every city as I directed you. Namely, if a man is above reproach, the husband of one wife, having children who believe, not accused of dissipation or rebellion." And then it goes on and gives some more qualifications there. Now, this verse in particular has been the subject of much debate, and you've done some research and study on this recently. I've studied it in the past as well for certain reasons, and I think I'd just be interested. So the debate here is whether this is saying children of elders need to be believers or whether they need to be faithful. And so before we get into the ins and outs of that issue, I guess I would just ask first, why is this important and what drew you to this issue?
Sure. Now, let me read the CSB on this, the Christian Standard Bible, just to give the listeners an understanding of the different way in which this is translated, because as you mentioned, this could be translated children who are believers. The CSB puts it this way: an elder must be blameless, the husband of one wife, with faithful children who are not accused of wildness or rebellion. So there's the difference, right? Is it believing or is it faithful? Now you ask the question, why is this a point of interest for me? It actually stems from a conference I went to a couple of years ago. It was a marriage conference in which the couple who were leading the marriage conference actually had an unbelieving daughter. And they were discussing how at a previous point in their ministry, they were let go from a ministry because his daughter did not believe. And in his case, his daughter wasn't wild or rebellious or anything. She just didn't believe. She mentioned, "I wish I could believe, but I just don't believe." And so he was let go from that ministry. And so he talked about in that marriage context what to do in reference to what happens if a child doesn't believe, that sort of thing. So that got me thinking, well, of course, I'm a father of 3 girls, and I'm in ministry. So it's not merely that I'm looking at this from the outside. I'm thinking, what is my position on this in light of the fact that people disagree? And the time to find out what your position is on this is not when your daughter comes to you and says, "I don't believe," and now you got to figure out what you're going to do.
Right.
Do I resign? Am I fit for ministry anymore? The time to do it is before that situation ever arises. And so I set myself to say, what's the answer to this question? And as I did my own research on it, I discovered that there isn't much in terms of research papers, that sort of thing, that had been written on this topic. So I'm actually going to be presenting a paper at the Council of Dispensational Hermeneutics that's going to be hosted here in a few weeks on this topic. And then, Lord willing, this will be published at some point as well.
Oh, that's great. I think I just want to second what you said about deciding an issue before you're in the midst of it. Sometimes that's not possible, admittedly. And I can imagine even some of the viewers or listeners to this podcasts are in the throes of trying to work through that themselves,
Yeah.
which is why they're saying, hey, I want to listen to this. But I will say, too, I've said this before, when your emotions are involved in an issue, it's very difficult to be, steadfast to what the text is actually teaching.
Yeah.
And we see that in so many scenarios, but I just try to really tell people the more emotional a situation is, the more you have to try to be unemotional in examining it. And that can be so difficult if you're going through that. On a personal note, I just will throw this out there because I think it's a funny anecdote for myself, is that this was the first issue that I disagreed with John MacArthur on anything. Like I used to, if MacArthur said something, I used to remember telling my dad, he's studied the Bible for 40 years. Like, who would ever want to disagree with him? And it was hard for me to say, I'm not sure he's right on this. And so he is one guy who would take this as believing children. Now, there are others who would say, no, it's got to be faithful. So what's the most common viewpoint on this? Are most people saying it's believers, that they're faithful?
Yeah, so I share your trepidation in walking in a place where someone I deeply respect, I disagree with. But at the same time, we can't put the interpretive model of somebody else on a pedestal as the perfect. And I think if Dr. MacArthur were here, he would say, yeah, I wouldn't want you to do that. Right. I'd want you to go back to the scriptures. Right. So, what is the most common view on this? Well, if you just look at the translations, they do lean towards the believing position rather than the faithful position. For instance, the NASB, the ESV, the NIV, the NRSV all have believing. There are some, and primarily it seems more on the more recent side. And I think that there's actually a bit of a turn in terms of the way that people are translating this and even commentaries on this. But the CSB, as I read at the beginning here, and then the Net Bible, actually all the way back to the King James Version. The King James Version had this as faithful children, not believing children. And then even the Legacy Standard Bible, which just came out, has the faithful. So there's a debate within the translations. If you look at the commentaries, I looked at all the major commentaries, I looked at a lot of minor commentaries, and I would say if I were to put a statistic to it, about 2/3 of them suggest translating it as believing. That's what they have, or that's what they defend. Basically, all of the major lexicons, if they refer to this passage, refer to it as believing rather than as faithful. Now, I should say many of those commentaries who say believing then go on to define it in such a way that it's not really believing. So they defend that translation, but they have a more faithful nuance in terms of the way that they suggest it ought to be actually applied. But if you were to ask the question, what does the average evangelical church believe on this topic? I'm not sure that we really have a sense of that. At least I don't. But I do hear about churches who let pastors go and pastors who resign because of this situation. So clearly that position is out there.
Yeah. And so this is a issue that has very important ramifications to daily church life. Should you allow somebody to be in church leadership if they have an unbelieving child? So, there's a lot at stake here. So no pressure as we talk about this.
Yeah, no, for sure.
And obviously what's driving us is trying to be faithful to the text. And so with that in mind, so you've kind of given us the lay of the land with how, the percentages kind of lay out and how people interpret this and even the translations, and that's super helpful. What about, so when we're actually dealing with issues like this, obviously one of the main things is, well, what is the word and how is that word treated? We talk about this with regard to lexical analysis. And so when you look at this word, what word is it in Greek and how is it typically translated? How are you working through the lexical analysis of this issue?
Yeah, so one of the things you want to do whenever you're looking at an issue like this is you can't just look at the English. You've got to look at what's the underlying word. Because again, and here's one of those reasons, let me encourage all listening and viewing to take Greek at some point. Amen. And maybe Hebrew too, but certainly Greek. But what we want to do is we want to look at what's the word that underlies this, and then what does that word in itself mean? Because I actually think part of the problem that we get is that we take a English translation and then we say, well, what does that word mean in English? But we want to get back and say, what does this word mean in its original context? And so what we find is that the word pistos, which is the word at play here, and if you know any Greek, you recognize pisteuo is the word for believe, and so pistos is a noun form of that, and so you can see why some lean towards that believing side of things. But when we look at the actual word, it has an active and a passive sense. I'm not saying active and passive in terms of who's doing the action, but active and passive in the sense of it can be believing or faithful. And both of these exist in our New Testament. Now, if we're just doing a statistical analysis, what we'd find is that every use in the Septuagint of this word is faithful every time, 74 times. Of the New Testament uses of the word, 67 times it's used. 54 are in the passive sense of faithful, and only then 13 in the sense of believing. Paul, for instance, in Titus, in the book of Titus, he uses it 3 times, 2 times unambiguously in the faithful sense, and then the 1 time, which is the ambiguous one we're talking about at the present moment, we have to determine. But if you notice in the passage, he actually immediately goes after this passage. So we're in verse 6, but if you look down in verse 9, Paul refers to the word of God as pistos. And the word of God is not believing.
Right.
The word of God is faithful. So in my own view, all 3 uses of Paul here in Titus would be in this passive sense of faithful, not believing. Now, of course, you can't just do statistics that way. Anybody who's done word studies know you can't just say, well, statistically, then it's 80% chance that it's this. Yeah. Because you still have that 20%, so you've got to go contextually. Is there anything else lexically that gives us a clue as to which way to go? Now, MacArthur, Nicoletti, and Rayburn and Nicoletti wrote an article in, and you can then read MacArthur's view on this in his commentary on Titus. But Nicoletti and Rayburn say this. They say, no use of the adjective faithful in Paul or the rest of the New Testament suggests that Paul would employ it with respect to unrepentant, unbelieving children of Christian parents. And then MacArthur goes on to say something similar. He says, well, how could they be faithful if they're not believing? Right. But I think that there are 2 problems with that. I think first that they are importing the English idea of what is faithful onto a Greek word, because we're not asking what does it mean today for someone to be faithful, because I probably wouldn't use that language of my child who's unbelieving. Mm-hmm. But that's not the question. The question is, what is the New Testament word? Pistos.
We're talking about first century people speaking Greek. How would they use that?
That's exactly right. So I think that they are importing New Testament or English senses to a word that is improper. Knight, for instance, suggests in his commentary, he says, Pista here means faithful in the sense of submissive or obedient, as a servant or steward is regarded as pistos when he carries out the requests of his master. And I think one of the things Knight's getting at there, and I want to get at here, is I think the context of this word is within a household. And how then would you translate pistos within a household context? I think quite clearly you would translate it as obedient, because you've got the head of the family. And are those under him pistos? Are they faithful? Are they obedient? And in fact, lexically, we can look at the lexicons, and some of the lexicons actually translate this word as obedient. And that would obviously be something helpful. Now, of course, the second thing I'd say about this, lexically, is if somebody said, well, the word really means faithful here because, as they're faithful, they've got to be believing. I think that would only be the case if you can command obedience or command belief, right? So if I can command my child to believe, then they're disobedient if they don't believe. But if that's not within my purview, if that's outside my ability to convert them, then I don't think that they are unfaithful if they're not believing in regard to the word pistos.
Yeah, that's super helpful. And you talked about how first century Greek, that's what we're dealing with, contexts of faithfulness in that regard. And like you said, the word pistos is used with regard to servant-master relationships. And so that doesn't mean that the servant is embracing every viewpoint of the master. He's just being, submissive and faithful to what is being talked about there.
It's required in a man that he be found pistos. Well, that doesn't mean believing. I mean, it can't in the context in which Jesus uses that. Or that's used in the New Testament, and that's coming back from what Jesus says about the servants in a household. And again, that language is used of the servants in the household, that the head servant must be found faithful. Pistos, faithful. And I think that then translates quite well into what's happening here within this passage in which it's talking about household relations.
Right. That's helpful. And you've kind of talked about contextual surrounding context of other uses of pistos in Titus and even in the New Testament. I'm curious as to what other factors should we be looking at with regard to this. Like, obviously, there's 1 Timothy 3 and how that plays into this issue. It gives a list of elder qualifications. Any help we can get from that passage?
Oh, yeah. So for sure, a couple of things I want to say about the context side of things. So we've got some lexical arguments for why I think faithful is better than believing. But I think there's some really good contextual arguments. And those are significant for us. They ought to be significant, right? Context is king.
Yeah.
So what is the context of the passage? It's a context in which we're talking about an elder's qualifications for service. Okay, so here's an elder. Is he qualified for service? So then that makes me ask the question, when I look at the list of qualifications, and if you read that through Titus or you read it through in 1 Timothy, what you're going to find is that every one of the qualifications, with perhaps the exception of able to teach, okay, but that doesn't actually fit within that context. It's a little before. But all of the qualifications would be qualifications that the man is capable of doing something about. They're in some way related to his competencies. If this were a passage that refers to the election of the children, and that we'll get to that theological side in just a little bit, I just don't think that's within the competency of the elder, or the potential elder. Second, I think the grammar of the passage actually suggests to us this, because you'll notice what it does. It doesn't just end with that statement we indicated. Notice again, if anyone is above reproach, the husband of one wife and his children, this is the ESV, are believers. And then you'll notice what the ESV does. It says, and not open to the charge of debauchery and insubordination. Now, if I were to take you to the Greek, what you'd find is there's no and. There's no chi here. There's no conjunction. So why does the ESV put it here? I think the ESV puts it here because it doesn't make sense without it. But it isn't there. Because, and I think this is the reason why, because if you read it this way, that if anyone's above reproach, the husband of one wife and his children are faithful, not open to the charge of debauchery or insubordination. What's happening now is you're no longer getting multiple layers of qualifications, but you've got one qualification that then is itself qualified. And what does it mean that his children are faithful? It means that they're not open to the charge of debauchery. They're not open to the charge of insubordination. So I think the grammar of the passage actually leads us directly in that. So
in other words, you're saying that those two phrases, not accused of dissipation or rebellion or not accused of debauchery, those are further defining what it means to be faithful.
Yeah, the Greek, I think, directly points in that direction. And I think it's a sign to us that when we translate it into Greek, we've got to add a conjunction there, that maybe we've gotten off the right path. Now, you mentioned the 1 Timothy passage. I think that is another critical component of this. And we know that we can't simply take one passage from another book and transfer it. But we recognize that books like Ephesians and Colossians, or books like the Gospels, that there are parallels that exist between these, just naturally by means of what they're written. And you can't deny that there are parallels between 1 Timothy and Titus. These are likely written nearly at the same time and are covering many of the same bases. So what does it look like when we turn over to 1 Timothy in terms of the requirements of an elder? What do we find? Well, Paul says here, he must manage his own family well and see that his children obey him. Different word Paul uses there, but it's clear. It's written reference to obedience. Now, if you're going to suggest that Titus is different than 1 Timothy, then what you're going to have to suggest is that Titus actually has a higher qualification for an elder. And that seems problematic to me on a couple of levels. First, because one would expect that they would be identical. But second, because Crete is actually the more recent church plant, whereas Ephesus, where Timothy has been, actually has been around for some time. So one would actually expect a tighter, if there's going to be tighter qualifications, the opposite way. And so in any case, the parallel passage, I think, clearly heads us in the direction of the faithful rather than believing interpretation.
That makes sense. And so just to kind of summarize, the context of Titus seems to point toward faithful itself with the absence of the chi there, the and. They seem to be in apposition there, redefining or showing what the faithfulness would look like. And then also itself, comparing it with the broader context of Paul's other elder qualifications in 1 Timothy 3, it seems kind of like a push to me, at least, and like you're saying, I think you would agree with this, is it seems kind of a push to say that there would be such a stark difference in qualifications in those passages. It'd be very difficult to, find a reason for that.
Yes.
But okay, playing devil's advocate there, then like trying to, push back on this, how would somebody respond to those accusations? How would somebody like MacArthur or somebody else say the difference? Why is the difference between Titus and 1 Timothy 3 there then?
I really don't know. I think one of the things that I think pushes MacArthur and others into this position, this sorts of gets us into the theology side of this, is that they're looking at the broader qualifications, and they're looking at that initial qualification, which is that somebody is above reproach. And they're asking the question, what would above reproach look like? And they bring that into their own context. They bring that into their thought pattern, and they say, well, in order for somebody to be a pastor, they really should have believing kids. And if they don't have believing kids, how would that be viewed on the outside? Now that's a significant question. But I think that there are some real practical problems with that, especially when we come to Titus. I mean, how many of these, as Titus is trying to find elders, so they've got these elders who just believed, and now they're teaching the gospel to their kids, but to immediately expect them also to jump on board. And then, you've got the question of age and how old do they have to be. There are a number of practical questions that we could work through here. But I struggle to see why there would be a distinction between the two books. And I think you just have to say, well, there is.
Yeah.
I'm not sure.
Yeah, I agree. I don't think that there's a good response to that. I think that, like you even pointed out, you would expect the very foundational church of Ephesus, which Paul's pouring so much time and effort into, that he would expect there would be elders there who have believing children.
Exactly.
If that's what he was going to do.
Yes.
So I think that's helpful. Now, you mentioned theology being a part of this. And so I know that in my studying and reading on this, there is theology brought to bear on this with regard to God's sovereignty, for example. You want to kind of walk us through some of the theological considerations?
Yeah, I think the doctrine of election is a really hard one to maintain in light of a believing position. In other words, if you hold that what Paul is telling him here is that an elder has to have believing children, then I think logically you are then suggesting by that he has some sort of say over the election of his children. And maybe it's that God will make sure to elect the children of elders. But of course, I don't see that anywhere in Scripture. maybe it's just that by the force of godliness that's going to happen. And that becomes problematic just historically. You're an Old Testament prof here.
You say that with disdain.
No, I didn't mean it in any negative way, but think through the great men of the Old Testament and then think through their children.
Right.
And let's just talk about the two men that I think get the most praise, right? David, man after God's own heart. His family's a mess.
Man. Yeah.
And then you've got Hezekiah, who, a little bit later is said, no man even before him or after him is greater than him. So here's this bastion of faith, and then Manasseh, his son.
Yeah.
And it's like, so I think we run into some challenges there. So my own take on this is, if you hold to a doctrine of election, I'm just not sure how you can consistently hold to this position, unless you also hold that, simply put, God may choose that your children are not believers, and therefore that's just a sign,
right,
that you shouldn't be in pastoral ministry, and that's just the way it is.
And I think that that's how somebody would have to interpret it. But then you run into what you mentioned earlier, is that this seems like an odd elder qualification since he has nothing to do with it then.
Exactly.
And so then that seems to be out of place.
And I'm particularly concerned about that because, and you may see some of this, I get a lot of churches asking, we need pastors, right? Mm-hmm. So one of the things I'm excited about for the seminary is we need to be producing more pastors than we are right now. There's a need for more pastors. Mm-hmm. And if we're holding to a standard that I think is not scriptural, that's tighter than what Scripture is for pastors, and we're already short on pastors. Now, this isn't a pragmatic, it's up in the air 50-50, so let's go with this easier one because, no, I think the Scripture teaches this. But my fear for those who say, well, I'm leaning towards your position, but it's possible that it could be this, and so I'm going to hold to this quote-unquote higher standard.
Right.
I think we're holding to an unbiblical standard, and we are then in danger of telling a man who has the desire, who has the ability, who has everything, but his child doesn't believe, and we're telling him, no, we don't want you in pastoral ministry. We are then denigrating the very gifts that God's given to the church.
Yeah, that's so true. And that just goes to show this has tremendous ramifications. And so I guess on that note, just talking about practical issues, walk us through some principles, or, you're counseling a church that has an elder who has children or a child that is, unfaithful.
Yeah.
What kind of guidelines should the church implement? How should they work through that issue? I mean, there's got to be ramifications here. Maybe even address a little bit, like as far as when the child is no longer under the authority of their parents. Like how that's a big issue too.
I think that is a big question. Now, here's what I'd say. So I believe what the text is saying is that an elder must have control over his family. Mm-hmm. And I think it's logical. This is where Paul's getting it, because in 1 Timothy 3, what he says is that the man must have control over his family, because he is now going to be leading the household of God. So he makes an analogy between the home here and the bigger church, which is a family. And he says, if you're unqualified here, then you're going to be unqualified there.
Right.
So that's why this is a significant issue. If we see an elder who has no control over his house, then that suggests to me that he's not going to be able to control the household of God. And here's what I'd say. I think that there are really faithful men, godly men, who have unbelieving children, but who are faithful children. They're obedient children. And I think that there are other men who may not have control of their house. They may have believing children, because that wasn't in their ultimate control anyways. But they more likely will have children who are rebellious or who are that way. And so that's why I think the principle makes sense. That's why it's in this list, because what we want individuals who have shown capacity to lead. And now they can lead in this capacity. Now, what happens when a pastor is leading and his child does something that is clearly problematic. Well, I would come back to 1 Timothy 1:6 because notice again,
Titus 1:6.
I'm sorry, Titus 1:6. If anyone is above reproach, a husband and one wife, and his children are faithful, that's how it's translated, not open to the charge of debauchery or insubordination. Those two words, if you trace those out in Scripture, this isn't like somebody says no to their dad in front of other people. This is egregious sorts of sins. And this insubordination is that sort of high-handedness of which, coming back to the Old Testament, you get stoned in the Old Testament, right?
Mm-hmm.
So how do you adjudicate when that's taken place? Well, Paul doesn't give us the exact sort of a thing. But of course, he doesn't with many of these qualifications. What does it mean that a man can teach? Because some people can teach better than other people can teach.
Right.
So there's a variation there. But I would simply say, I think the major category is the one we ought to keep in mind here, which is when is a man blameless? And I don't think blameless means that nothing can be said against him. But when is he in such a way that the people within the church or the people outside the church look at him and just say, that isn't someone I could follow.
Right.
That isn't someone to emulate
because
of the insubordination of their kids. So and I know that that's not a specific answer, but I'm not sure there is a specific answer. Right. But a church leadership ought to come together and say, listen, our pastor's child is a wild, and it is known within the community, is known within our community, and we just can't. We can't have him in that role because of that. So that again, it's not as specific as I'd like to be, but I'm not sure that we can be extremely specific.
No, and I think to add to that, the one thing I would say is that I think a lot of churches, unfortunately, are kind of lazy with regard to this. I mean, you could go on both sides of the spectrum, but one of the things that I see occasionally is that I think a clear defining mark would be if the elder's child, whether it be the full-time pastor or any of the elders, the child is not just, acting up at certain times, but, known as being one of the worst kids in the community. That's when you really, that definitely is, I think, hurting the above reproach kind of mandate where your child is literally worse than an unbeliever.
Yeah, exactly.
That's kind of a problem.
So in one of the other things I want to add here, you asked earlier about the timing of this. That is it within the home or not? Well, I think it is within the home, and that's what Paul's point here is. So in at least the United States of America, we tend to have our children in the home until 18, and then they're out on their own. If you hold to the believing perspective and you hold to the perseverance of the saints, a 60-year-old pastor could have a 40-year-old son who apostatizes from the faith. And there are some commentators who would say that that's a disqualifying feature of that man's ministry because he should have evangelized this child when they were in their home. And if he had done so successfully, then this person wouldn't apostatize later because of the perseverance of the saints. And now all of a sudden you've got this man who has had a 40-year ministry perhaps disqualified because of his adult son. That just doesn't make any sense to me at all. Whereas the perspective of we're seeing you lead your home and your child who's in the home is wild and not under your control. I believe that God has given us the ability to raise children in such a way that they can be in obedience. I love it. I mean, not in fearful obedience, but that they love you because you love them and they want to respect you. I believe that's quite possible. And so that's why Paul makes it a requirement for an elder.
Yeah, I think that's super helpful. And kind of let me throw in a little Old Testament here.
Sure.
As well. Just a little Old Testament backing for this. I think we see this kind of idea of a transition from inside the home to outside the home throughout. And I think I believe it's Numbers 30, if I remember correctly, talks about the principles for making vows, and the husband and father figure if he hears his son making a vow, he has the authority to say, no, you can't make that vow. However, the chapter specifies that when the child is on his own and he makes that vow, the father then the child who's older now has complete responsibility before God in making that vow. And so I think even there you have clear indication that there's a transition of responsibility before God for your life.
Exactly.
And so I just think, I agree 100% with what you're talking about there. So obviously one other side of the practical issue here is kind of the discouragement of elders and pastors who have had children walk away from the faith. I mean, I think everybody would know certain pastors, well known, who have had children who do not profess to be believers. But even, the small town pastor that nobody knows has had a child who walks away from the faith. Do you have any practical wisdom or insight, just encouragement to them?
Yeah. So just the other day, I actually was somewhere where Pastor Stephen Davey, who's the pastor of the Shepherd's Church here, was talking to some pastors or some parents, and he was addressing this very issue. And he made this statement that I thought was really helpful. He said, when he talks to parents whose child has walked away from the faith and they feel guilt over it, they can't get over that this happened and they feel like they're responsible for it. He asks them this question: would you take credit if your child believed? And he knows the answer they're going to give. Well, no. And he says, so then don't take all the credit for them not believing. And I think that's a really helpful perspective to bring to it, that I'm not fully in control over this. And so I've done what I've done. I've done what I've could. But the other thing I would say is that I think if there's breath, then we should maintain hope. And coming back to Hezekiah, all right? So Hezekiah, he only had 15 years to live. If he co-reigned with his son, I think he dies way before his son ever repents. But here's Manasseh, the worst Old Testament character.
Oh, yeah.
I think perhaps even than Ahab. I mean, he's bad.
Oh, yeah.
And yet, do you see God calls out to him, right? Like if you read, 2 Chronicles 33? 2 Chronicles 33, it says, and God speaks to him, but he doesn't listen. And then God sends him to Assyria with a hook in his mouth, right? And while he's there, the text says, he humbles himself. And he prays. And what's really fascinating about that passage is the end of the passage, because when the chronicler then is talking about Manasseh's life, what he says is these were the things he did before he was humbled. And then here's what he did after. Now, I'm getting emotional here, but I think of that and I think of God's mercy and kindness. Because here is a man who deserved none of it. Here's a man who knew the gospel, right, in terms of the Old Testament proclamation of it, from a child. He had a godly father who loved the Lord, walked completely away from it, did the worst things. And God never swept him off the scene. God continued to use his word. God then used an event in his life that pulled him back. And so I would just say to pastors or whoever's listening who has an unbelieving child, don't give up hope. If God did it for Manasseh, and if God did it for Paul, I mean, Paul says that God saved me as an example that he can basically take the dregs of society and redeem them. And so in the same way, we shouldn't lose hope, even despite very hard circumstances.
No, that's so cool. Yeah, and super encouraging. I've seen that many times where God saves the unsavable.
Yeah, exactly.
That's so cool. And it's one of those things where our theology does come into play because we trust in his sovereignty. He's working the best plan out.
Exactly.
And so we can say, the Lord gives, Lord takes away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. He's going to be shown as righteous at the end. And so we can...
Shall not the God of all the earth do right?
Amen.
And he does.
Well, Tim, thanks so much for joining us on the podcast today. It's been a blast hanging out with you. I hope you'll come on again soon.
I hope so too.
So those of you who want more information on this, I'll link to the blog article that I wrote on this a while back. I'll also link to a few other episodes in the description below. If you want more information about me, you can check out the articles I've written at petergaiman.com. You can visit Shepherd's Theological Seminary, where both Tim and I teach, at shepherds.edu. Until next time, may the Lord bless you and keep you and make his face shine upon you.